You're not the mother you used to be. Those were the words that shattered the silence over dinner. David said them like a throwaway comment, while reaching for more wine, like he wasn't cutting straight into me in front of our children. I sat there, frozen. My fork halfway to my mouth. Sophie's eyes darted toward me, wide and unsure. Lucas stared down at his plate like if he didn't move, it might all go away. I wanted to scream, to throw my napkin in his smug face and walk out. But instead, I did what I'd taught myself to do over the past 10 years. I swallowed the lump in my throat and smiled politely, like I didn't just bleed inside. Because in David's world, appearances mattered more than truth. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. Big house. Weekend soccer games. Matching family Christmas pajamas. He was the successful entrepreneur. I was the stay-at-home mom who gave up a 6-figure job in finance to support his dream. And for a while, I believed it was love. I believed it when he said, "We're a team," when he asked me to step back from my career. I believed it even when his praise slowly turned into subtle criticisms. Even when my opinion on anything beyond dinner plans became irrelevant. He'd say things like, "You're lucky you don't have to worry about bills," or "I make the money so you don't have to," like financial dependence was a gift I should be grateful for. What he didn't know was, every time he said those things, he planted a seed. And over time, those seeds grew into questions. Quiet ones, at first. Then louder. Then so loud I couldn't ignore them. What if something happened to him? What if he left? Who would I be without him? Would I even recognize myself? The real breaking point wasn't even about me. It was about our kids. When I found out about the affair, it wasn't just betrayal. It was clarity. I saw him for who he really was, not just a cheating husband, but a man who would twist reality to serve himself. And when I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He smirked. "You're not exciting anymore, Elena. You've become beige." Beige. That night, I stood in the dark kitchen alone after everyone had gone to bed. The hum of the fridge was the only sound, and I couldn't stop thinking, if I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone know who I really was? Because I didn't recognize her either. But that was the night I made the decision. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to rebuild. For me. For Sophie. For Lucas. David had no idea that the woman sitting across the table from him, the one he thought he could manipulate, diminish, erase, was already waking up. And what he would try to do next would change everything. The next morning, I pulled out the navy blazer I hadn't worn in years. It still fit. A little snug around the shoulders, but that felt right. Like I'd grown into something I didn't know I was allowed to be again. I sat at my laptop, hands trembling slightly, and reopened my old resume. It was out of date, of course. 10 years out of the game meant my LinkedIn was a digital graveyard. But my brain? It hadn't dulled. It had simply been rerouted, into lunchboxes and bedtime stories, into birthday parties and scraped knees. I'd been managing crises for a decade, I just hadn't been paid for it. By noon, I'd updated my resume, reached out to 3 former colleagues, and scheduled a call with a friend who'd started her own firm. She didn't even hesitate. "Elena, I've been hoping you'd come back. Let's talk Monday. I've got something in mind." When David got home that night, I didn't say a word about it. I played the role he expected, the homemaker who asked about his day and served his favorite pasta. But inside, something had clicked. And I knew I had to move carefully. Because David wasn't the kind of man who took change lightly. Especially not when it threatened his control. Over the next few weeks, I quietly rebuilt my professional network. I brushed up on industry trends after the kids went to bed, took online courses, and had Zoom interviews behind closed doors. My confidence came back piece by piece, like muscle memory. The offer came on a Friday morning. A senior advisory role at a boutique financial firm, with flexible hours and a generous benefits package. I stared at the email, hand covering my mouth. I hadn't even told the kids I was job hunting. Part of me was afraid they'd be disappointed, that they'd think I was abandoning them. That night, at dinner, I told them. I'm going back to work, I said gently. Part-time at first. I'll still be here for everything you need. But it's time for me to do something for myself, too. Sophie looked up from her plate. It's about time, she said, a half-smile playing at her lips. You're way too smart to be making peanut butter sandwiches all day. Lucas didn't say anything. He just nodded, and his eyes, those quiet, steady eyes, shone with something I hadn't seen in a while. Pride. But David? His fork froze midair. You're what? He said. I've accepted a position, I replied calmly. It's a good opportunity. He scoffed. You don't need to work, Elena. And who's going to handle things here? Dinner? Groceries? The kids' schedules? I held his gaze. I've been handling all of that. Alone. For a decade. I think I'll manage. He didn't argue after that. Not right away. But I saw it in his face, the crack in his carefully constructed world. I was shifting. And he didn't like it. What I didn't know then, was just how far he'd go to keep things from changing. Things began to shift subtly at first. Little things. Groceries that used to magically restock themselves were suddenly forgotten. David would leave the house without saying a word about picking up Lucas from soccer practice. I'd find myself scrambling, rearranging my new work schedule just to keep the household running. Then came the guilt trips. You've been gone a lot lately, he'd say casually, while scrolling through his phone at dinner. The kids notice, you know. Sophie asked why you don't make waffles on Saturdays anymore. Which was a lie. Sophie had never liked waffles. David did. It was clear he didn't like the new version of me. The one with meetings and purpose. The one who no longer asked for permission before making decisions. He couldn't say it outright, too proud for that. But he started using the one weapon he thought I couldn't defend against. The kids. I noticed it one evening, when I came home a little later than usual. Sophie was unusually quiet, and Lucas wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked how their day had been, and Sophie shrugged. Dad said you're too busy for us now, she mumbled. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. What else did he say? I asked gently. Nothing, she said. Just, you used to be around more. I didn't argue. Not then. I didn't want to put them in the middle. But inside, I burned. He was turning them against me. Slowly. Skillfully. Like a man who thought he was playing chess, and I was too dim to even see the board. I tried to counter it with love. With attention. With honesty. But the moments kept stacking up. I'd find Sophie doing the dishes, something I usually did, and when I thanked her, she'd say, Dad said I should start helping more since you're never home. Lucas became withdrawn. He spent more time in his room. When I checked in, he'd smile and say he was fine, but I knew better. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes when I hugged him. Like he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. One night, I overheard David talking to his mother on the phone. She's not the same anymore, he whispered. It's like she thinks she's better than this life now. Than me. Than me. Not once did he say, she's happy. Or she's thriving. It was all about him. About what he was losing. That's when I realized, he didn't just want me to stay. He wanted me to stay small. But what David didn't understand, what he never could understand, was that our children were smarter than he gave them credit for. And the truth has a way of seeping through, even when someone tries to bury it. And soon, it would come to the surface in a way he could never control. I still remember the night Sophie left a note on my desk. It was a torn-out page from her school notebook, folded twice, tucked beneath a printout I'd been reviewing for work. Written in her neat handwriting were just 8 words. We see more than you think we do. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. My heart thudded, both hopeful and terrified. Had she overheard something? Had she been watching him too? The next morning, she was already at the breakfast table when I walked into the kitchen. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me, really looked. And then she smiled. Not a forced one. A small, knowing smile. That afternoon, when I got home, the dishwasher was running. Lucas was wiping down the counters. David was nowhere to be found. We decided to help out more, Lucas said, not looking up. I blinked. Did your father say something? Lucas hesitated. No. We just figured, you do a lot. More than he gives you credit for. My knees nearly buckled. I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep the tears at bay. They were beginning to see. From then on, something shifted. They didn't say much, but I could feel it. They were listening differently. Watching more closely. Picking up on the cracks in David's stories. One Saturday, Sophie asked if she could go with me to the library while I worked. I agreed, and while we were there, she pulled a book off the shelf titled Women and Power in Family Systems. She held it up and said, "This looks like your life." I laughed. But it wasn't a joke. Later that week, Lucas came into my room holding a flash drive. He looked nervous. I found this in Dad's drawer, he said quietly. It has stuff. Messages. Pictures. From that woman. He paused. I didn't mean to snoop. But I saw her name on a message once, and I started wondering. I've had it for a while. I just didn't know what to do with it. I froze. Lucas, you shouldn't have had to carry this alone. I know. But I didn't want to hurt you. Or Sophie. I wrapped my arms around him. My sweet, quiet boy had been protecting me in the only way he knew how. That night, I finally understood. David may have thought he could manipulate our kids like puppets. Tell them stories and lies. Paint me as the selfish one. But he underestimated something crucial. Our children had eyes. And hearts. And minds of their own. And they were already on my side. David always liked an audience. So when he invited his parents over for dinner on a Thursday night, midweek, unannounced, I knew something was coming. He was wearing that smug, performative smile. The one he used during client dinners or charity galas. It made my skin crawl. Dinner was awkward. Forced pleasantries, tension hanging thick like humidity. I plated the roasted chicken and vegetables as always, but my appetite had long since gone. Sophie and Lucas sat quietly, exchanging glances only I could read. Halfway through the meal, David set down his fork with a dramatic sigh. I think it's time we talk about the elephant in the room, he said, wiping his mouth slowly with a napkin. Elena has decided to prioritize her career over her family. His mother's eyes widened slightly. His father kept chewing, unbothered. I didn't respond. Not yet. David went on, she's barely around anymore. The kids come home to an empty house. I've had to rearrange my own schedule to make sure someone's here. It's affecting the whole family. David, I started, but he raised a hand, silencing me. I'm not saying work isn't important, he continued, but when a mother chooses boardrooms over bedtime stories, I think we have to ask, what kind of message does that send our children? It was the moment he'd been building toward. He expected applause. Sympathy. Maybe even tears from his parents. Instead, it was Sophie who spoke. That's enough. Her voice cut through the room like glass breaking. David blinked. Excuse me? Sophie stood. Her chin high, her eyes unwavering. You want to talk about what kind of message is being sent? How about the fact that you've been lying to all of us for months? Sophie, sit down, he barked. Lucas rose too. No. She's right. David looked between them, stunned. Sophie continued, you think we didn't notice the late-night calls, the secret messages, the way you talk to Mom like she's your employee? I saw David's face drain of color. His mother covered her mouth. His father finally stopped chewing. Lucas reached into his hoodie pocket and placed a flash drive on the table. I saved everything. The messages. The photos. From your business meetings. The room fell into stunned silence. David stood abruptly. I cannot believe this. Elena, you've poisoned them against me. I met his eyes calmly. I didn't have to. You did that all by yourself. You manipulated them. No, Sophie said, stepping closer. You just assumed we were too naive to see what was really happening. You underestimated us. Lucas nodded. You underestimated all of us. David's bravado deflated, replaced by a twisted cocktail of rage and shame. He left the room without another word, slamming the door to his office. I exhaled slowly. My hands were still shaking. But my heart felt stronger than ever. Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't standing alone. The days after that dinner were eerily quiet. David sulked in silence, retreating into his office or leaving 4 meetings without a word. He didn't try to defend himself anymore, but he didn't apologize either. Not to me, and not to the kids. Sophie and Lucas, on the other hand, became my anchors. Lucas started waiting up for me when I got home late, asking how my day went, offering to reheat leftovers. Sophie, who used to hide in her room with earbuds in, now sat with me at the kitchen counter, helping me prep lunch for the next day, asking questions about my work, about finance, contracts, negotiation. She wanted to learn. I filed for divorce the following week. I didn't make a scene about it. No drama. Just calm, decisive action. I'd already spoken with a lawyer, gathered all the documents, and mapped out a financial plan with the help of my team at work. Years of being underestimated had taught me to prepare in silence. David was furious when he was served the papers. This is what you wanted all along, isn't it? He spat. A career, your own life. Well, congratulations. You're on your own now. I didn't reply. Because he was wrong about one thing. I had never wanted to be alone. But I would never again choose to stay somewhere I wasn't respected. The divorce proceedings were long and bitter. David tried to argue that I had no income for a decade and therefore wasn't entitled to anything. But my lawyer presented detailed records of every financial decision I had supported, every project I'd helped him strategize, every hour I spent managing the household so he could thrive professionally. We showed the judge evidence of financial control and emotional manipulation. I won full custody of the kids. David was granted supervised visitation. The house was sold. I used my share to buy a small but bright 3-bedroom apartment closer to my new office. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every framed photo on the wall, I chose with intention. There were no ghosts in the closets. Only new beginnings. Work flourished. I was promoted to Director of Client Strategy within a year. I launched a mentorship program for women re-entering the workforce after career breaks, and I started a blog, anonymous at first, about reclaiming your voice after being silenced. And the most beautiful part? Watching my children thrive in the quiet stability of truth. Sophie became a fierce young woman, unapologetically opinionated, just like her mother finally allowed herself to be. Lucas found solace in music, joining the school band and composing songs he never let anyone hear, except me. One Saturday afternoon, we sat together on the balcony, sipping tea as the sun dipped low. "Mom," Sophie said, "you were always strong. We just didn't know how strong until everything fell apart." I smiled, blinking away tears. "Sometimes things have to fall apart," I said, "so we can finally build what we were meant to." 2 years later, my life looked nothing like the one I had built with David. And thank God for that. I now led the financial empowerment division at the firm, where I helped women, especially those recovering from financial abuse, learn how to manage money, grow wealth, and rebuild their lives from the ground up. Every time I stood in front of a group of women who thought it was too late for them, I told them about me, not all the details, but enough for them to understand that I wasn't speaking from theory. I was living proof that survival could evolve into power. Sophie had just been accepted into her first-choice college. Pre-law. She said she wanted to become a family attorney, one that truly listened to women and helped them stand up for themselves. When I read her application essay, I cried for an hour. She wrote about me. About the night she stood up for me. About what it taught her about courage. Lucas? My quiet boy had built a budgeting app for teens as his sophomore project. It had thousands of downloads. When a teacher asked him what inspired it, he said, "My mom. She taught me that financial knowledge is power, and no one should feel powerless." David still had supervised visitation, though he showed up inconsistently. He'd softened over time, or maybe he'd just grown quieter. He'd tried a few times to apologize, to the kids, to me. I accepted the apology. Not for him, but for myself. Forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was freedom. One rainy Sunday, as I sat at my desk updating the curriculum for our next empowerment seminar, I looked up and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A photo of me, Sophie, and Lucas on the wall, laughing at a park, hair windswept, eyes bright. There was a lightness in that photo I hadn't seen in years. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. People ask me now if I regret the years I spent trying to make my marriage work. I don't. Because those years shaped the woman who eventually said, "Enough." Because those years showed my children what it means to reclaim dignity with grace. And because without them, I might have never discovered the strength that was mine all along. David once tried to turn my children against me. He underestimated their intelligence. He underestimated the truth. But most of all, he underestimated me. And that was his biggest mistake. This story reminds us. Sometimes the people we try hardest to protect are the ones who end up saving us. Elena didn't win with revenge. She won with truth, patience, and dignity. And her children? They didn't need to be told what to believe. They knew. Because love, real love, leaves clues. What do you think about how Elena handled this situation? Would you have done the same? Comment below, type 2 if you admire her strength, or 7 if you think she should have acted differently. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe to True Tales. A new story's coming soon. And this next one? It starts with a funeral, and ends with a courtroom surprise.